My wife and I were coming back from Paris in 2002. Is that all right? Is that all right? We're coming back from Paris in 2002. My wife had had a very strange experience in the Luxembourg Gardens around about lunchtime. We were sitting there in the bright sunlight, and suddenly she looked absolutely shattered, got up, walked away, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I don't know. Suddenly a great blackness descended over me. I feel awful." She pulled herself together. We got on the plane. We flew from Paris to Bristol. At the airport, before we were allowed to get off the plane, an announcement came from the pilot: "Will Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton please stay on the plane?" We were met by a couple of police, took us off the plane, drove us all the way back to Devon. We had to identify my son's personal belongings and later his body. Roughly at that moment, this is a kind of classic Myersian situation, Ralph had died in a car accident on July the 7th, 2002. That started my quest. And I asked myself three questions. One, has there ever been a body of people who've taken this whole field seriously because of all the popular image of this area? I discovered the Society for Psychical Research. Yes, that was a yes answer to my first question. The second question was, if I did a personal investigation of the area, could I come up with any evidence, not that would necessarily convince me, but was worth considering and looking at? Not proving survival, but just an area that suggested some possible link between mind and paranormal phenomena, and that the mind wasn't totally dependent on the brain, on the body. That was the second part of the quest. The third part of the quest was, has anyone ever produced a body of information which categorically proves life after death? That was the cross-correspondence book. So the three books: my personal investigation into mediumship, the study of Myers, and thirdly, a high-quality body of evidence that suggests survival. I'm still, probably like a lot of you, I'm still no nearer a final solution or an answer. These bits of information are intriguing, but they are not conclusive, and there are always alternative explanations. As part of that process, my next book will be looking more closely at the nature of personal identity, because that seems to me, for many of us, the whole core of the problem. And I have to thank Bernard Carr and the Perrick Warwick Foundation, who helped with some funding towards the Myers and the cross-correspondence books, and this third project, which is looking at two of the greatest mediums of the 20th century, Gladys Osborne Leonard and Geraldine Cummings, and trying to map the evidence that they produced against the recent documentation that has come out about some of the famous people that they provided information for. And it works both ways. The more famous the person, the more the information that is generated, the closer you have to look to see whether there has been any leakage of any sort. On to Myers. If anyone was going to run the barricade, was going to come through from the other side, surely it would be Frederick W.H. Myers. Having read his biography and read lots of his letters, the passion of the man and the energy of the man and the intensity of the man leaps at you off the page. So let's just see what evidence there is of the continuing Myers through from round about the First World War up to the present day. This is not the cross-correspondences. Information independent from that, even though one or two of the people I'm going to mention had tangential links to cross-correspondences. There he is, you can't see him except vaguely, kind of a phantasm. Right, a caution. A very large book came out recently, The Myth of an Afterlife. And there's a great danger when you're in a circle or group of people like this, whether you're on the scientific wing or the experiential wing of the SBR, of actually a common set of assumptions that there is something there, that these things do occur, that they do transcend time and space and so on. And I've put that up at the beginning of both my short talks to keep reminding us of the alternative approach. This is what you might call the traditional scientific approach to it. I don't think that model necessarily works for psychic phenomena, but this is the kind of thing that you're up against and you need to bear in mind. And the fact this is the kind of orthodox body of knowledge, because if you look at Martin and Augustine's book, what they're actually doing, it's a kind of ritual. They're providing a huge amount of information. Can't be true, can't be true, can't be true. The evidence from physics, chemistry and biology and philosophy, it's, you've just deluded, your concepts aren't clear. Against it. So the legions of materialism, if you like, are sort of on the march and materialised. And how dare you think, as a psychic researcher or a parapsychologist, that your tiny fleeting bits of evidence can possibly challenge the enormous body of information that's developed since the 17th century. You're challenging the Enlightenment. That's the kind of assumption that seems to lie behind it. So we do need to keep that in mind all the time. Is it Myers? What you would want to do, of course, and this first talk, by the way, is on psychological issues to do with identity. Can we actually say the personality survives? Is it Myers in terms of his memories, in terms of his temperament, in terms of the things he was interested in, and so on? The second talk is about bodily identity. Is there any evidence whatsoever that some kind of physical form, even if it's called a spirit body, survives and can be identified in a different location? And if at a seance there's a materialization, how the hell do you prove that that is actually a body which is congruent with the body of the person in life? And this debate goes back to Sir William Crookes, doesn't it, in the late 19th century. So tests for psychological identity, content and style. What do we know about Myers, about his writing, about the things that he was interested in? Do we know that, are there any gaps in the mediums, in the knowledge of the mediums that come through that make you think, well, the real Myers would certainly have known about this, personal characteristics? Then the obvious things that you have to check, which all of you are doing most of the time, could this information have come from normal sources? And the thing that really interests me, having written a book on the cross correspondences, if he is Myers, does he know what's going on elsewhere? Does he know that he's communicated through other mediums? And does he know what was said? Even allowing for the whole question of difficulties of communications, and that we don't know the conditions under which these things operate. That's always been a concern of mine. Because I'm sure some of you have come across books supposedly written by famous pop stars, Elvis after his death, William James and so on. How can we actually match these things with the individual in life? And so much is obviously self-deception. The first set of scripts was written by Kenneth Richmond, and I've got a rare copy of a rare pamphlet. Started in the First World War. Richmond later became, during the Second World War, before it, he was the editor of the journal, and then during the war he was the research secretary of the society, and he had a flat in Tavistock Square. Very interesting, very strange man in some ways. Zoe Richmond was a medium. Her automatic writing scripts are in Cambridge. And in 1915, they knew nothing about Myers. Like a lot of intellectuals and academics, they moved down to Devon and Cornwall to escape from the war, to set up artist colony, and of course it was very cheap down there. He did some telepathy experiments. They were astonishingly successful, and then somebody called Myers, whom he didn't know, he said, seems to come through. And that's a typical, sorry, not the right one. That is a typical Myersian little puzzle. Not even, who are you? Try periphrasis. May, hair, is. Delete the even letters, and that spells Myers. And then slightly later on, quite sharply comes through, and it reminds me very much of Myers' analytical tone in a number of his letters. It's all wrong, this communication. Your auditory perception, he's really sort of saying, you know, you're not hearing properly. Your mental interpretation, you're fuzzy, and your verbal conclusion isn't an accurate report of what actually took place. Very schoolmasterly, isn't it? And then, at the bottom, and this is something Myers did a lot in life, Richmond's father, pusillanimous, which is a nice word, Richmond's father was Canon Wilfrid Richmond, who married a very young girl. He was well over 50, his wife was 17. They ignored their son, Kenneth. He was had a public school education in Scotland, but they wouldn't fund him to go on to university, to Oxford or Cambridge, because the father was much more interested in his young wife, and that affected Richmond. He was a very heavy drinker, had a lot of psychological problems, it led to tension between him. So Myers, of course, who was very, very keen on promoting the cause of psychical research, said, look, you should have taken it to this guy, to this clergyman, and told him the importance of this area. A lot of this stuff, had a lot of discussion about the nature of the subliminal, about the building up in human beings, the creative force and the destructive force, all that again very characteristic of Myers. And then one thing which particularly interested me was, it is this speech mediumship without actual trance which has been known before, and it's this power we are trying to recover. Now, if you want to link with with other scripts, the classic case was the speech communications of Winifred Coombe Tennant in the Cross Correspondences. The most vivid, the most lively communication. She was almost, it almost appears that she was directly communicating to Myers, and particularly Gurney, with whom she had a very close relationship. And the material that came through, I'm not saying it's paranormal at all, supernormal, or whatever word you want to use, I'm just saying it's extremely interesting. But it's useful that there's a link there in 1915-16 with the material that she didn't really begin to, which she was beginning to develop at around that same time. So there is a cross-reference there. They didn't actually, they were going to cooperate on the book, but Myers, for whatever reason, changed his mind. Now, we get into the area of deception here. Juliette Goodenough was an American social reformer who lived in Chicago. And around the time of the First World War, just afterwards, in certain circles, there was a very great interest in Myers. And she did automatic writing, and it almost makes your heart bleed, really, or weep, or whatever, when you look at the self-deception in this. Myers is summoning all these great world figures, the great intellectuals, to meet in Westminster to debate the future, future questions. This, of course, a bit after the First World War and the League of Nations and so on. And what should we be doing for the future? Look at the language. The consensus of opinion is that we assemble on the Westminster campus. That if Myers ever used the word campus in his life. And look at who we've got there to converse with each other. Gladstone, well, we knew he was interested in Psychical Research, Shakespeare, and there is an egregious poem that she writes, supposedly channeled from Shakespeare. Awful poem with lows and phony Elizabethan language. It's execrable. Some of these people I don't know. I know Patrick Henry, American History, or Emerson, a 19th century American intellectual. I don't know Channing. Beecher, I think, to do with abolition of slavery. Disraeli, of course. Abraham Lincoln, of course. George Washington. And William James. Poor old William James is almost like Myers. He keeps popping up through the 20th century, being channeled by a number of people. So one has to dismiss that totally. More interesting is, some of you may be familiar with the work of Thomas Glenn Hamilton, the Canadian doctor, who investigated physical mediumship in considerable depth. Myers appears to have come through in work with a number of illiterate mediums in the 1920s who were working with the trance mediums, who were working with the Hamiltons. References to Plato, Book 10, not the famous cave one, you know, where the slaves in the cave can't actually see genuine reality. It was more to do with an early near-death experience in Book 10, so which was relevant. Myers, in Winifred Coode Tennant, he keeps repeating his name, it's the same phenomenon. W.T. Stead is there, and then through table tilting they got quite a lot of information. And Lodge said when he got it, the message is characteristic of Myers, its brevity and pointedness. And that's something I've noticed through Myers. Very flowery language in Human Personality and Bodily Survival of Death, but in his private letters and his notes, he was very terse and to the point and gave very vivid one-line character descriptions of people. And I've got a complete edition of his photocopy of his 2-volume diary, and shows his kind of Victorian efficiency. He was able to condense the experiences of that day in one sentence, and he did that right from the 1860s right up to his death in 1901. He came through Mrs. Leonard, William Barrett's wife, who was a noted surgeon herself. She sat with Mrs. Leonard, and Myers came through. Now, this sort of stuff, I was very pleased to see Myers. I'm going to work with him. My renewed friendship with Myers, very true, not evidential at all though. And then you remember Myers talking to us, in time the coarser physical body in this life will be absorbed by the etheric. That is again is a theme that comes through a lot of them, Leonard and Cummins' mediumship, that there are two bodies, a physical body and a spiritual body, and it's worth looking at that later. Cummins, the most famous example of Myers' post-mortem communications, apart from the cross correspondences, the 2 books written by Geraldine Cummins. There's an example of cross correspondence there, but I'm not going to discuss it, would take too long. But working through it, it's fuzzy. Myers seems to remember and half forget what he was saying through one medium and what he was going to say through the other. And one would have to spend a lot of time working out in detail why it didn't completely get through and why it went wrong. But these were sittings fairly close together. And Myers, a sense of directness and purpose, he actually broke into somebody else's sitting. Now, how do you actually analyse the material? Well, I've photocopied all the cross-correspondence material into a PDF format. It took me 7 months to do it. So it's a searchable format, so you can put in any word and you can get all the occurrences in it. What I'd like to do if I had time would be to take The Road to Immortality and Beyond Human Personality, do the same thing with them, and see what links there are between the language of those 2 books and the language of Human Personality, because there is a version on the SPR website of the Myers 2 volumes, where you can search literally word by word. And one small example is the language that Cummings used. In terms of vocabulary, it's beyond her vocabulary in many cases. And secondly, little idiosyncratic things that Myers did, like using dashes a lot in his writing, then suddenly something occurs to him. Instead of creating a separate sentence, he put a dash, material, end of dash, and Cummings says she abhorred dashes, she loathed dashes, she found them extremely irritating. So there may be a possibility to, at some stage, if I had the skill and the time, to look into corpus stylistics, look into what's called authorial attribution, software programs which you can run, which will and have been used very often in terms of writer in the literary field with Shakespeare and Charles Dickens and so on, to see whether there is enough there to say that this could possibly have been by Myers. In terms of physical identification by people who knew Myers, Sir Lawrence Jones, Gerald Rendell, they both gave testimonies that this was the living Myers. This was the way the material came out in Road to Immortality and Beyond Human Personality. Myers was almost as if Myers was speaking with his kind of rhetorical flushes and so on. And the end of Human Personality, where he tries to pull it all together, and it is a kind of feverish spiritual oration linking the work of the SBR to a world soul, to endless cosmic development. Yep. Right. Okay. It's quite recognisable and revealing. There are cases where the Myers personality seems to break through in a kind of sort of spontaneous way at sittings. This guy, Hunt, who was a famous spiritualist in the 1930s, said, voice came through, voiced in the most cultured accents on behalf of a group, one of whom claimed to be F.W.A. Myers. Lengthy speech, convinced none of the living persons in the room could have given utterance to the beautifully phrased sentiments and educated diction of the words I heard addressed to me. Now that's spot on in terms of a character description of Myers. This group, the medium, Estelle Roberts, you say, well, how much would she know about Myers? She may not have done. Very famous, moving quickly on, material came from Geraldine Cummings and Raynard Johnson. He analysed this material in his book, The Light and the Gate. Again, that is very, very vivid. On philosophy, Douglas Fawcett's Imaginism, a philosophy that there was no absolute, no beginning, no end, just endless progression, and a large number of separate imaginative centres at various levels which creates the universe. And that has some links with other philosophies, and certainly linked with Myers' own view in life. Endless, no absolute, continuous growth, endless progression, said Myers. Importance of group souls. That, again, you see that in a lot of the literature. Probably one of the best examples of a Myers persona is in Swan on the Black Sea, Cummings. I'm particularly interested in things I can verify. And in Swan on the Black Sea, the communicator, Mrs. Coombe-Tennant, said Aunt Evelyn led, her possessiveness led her to turn Leo Myers, whom I'll talk about in a different context of outside the talk, to antagonise Leo against his father. That's exactly true. I've got a specific letter quoted in the book which shows Evelyn's possessiveness. Secondly, he developed a passion for a very beautiful married woman who rejected his passionate possessiveness. He took to drugs and, as you know, killed himself. Again, absolutely true. Iris Origo was the object of Leo Myers' affections. She rejected him. She preferred her husband, an Italian count. They did tremendous work together in the Second World War in the Italian resistance. She was a very remarkable person. And Leopold Myers became a very bitter and cynical man and committed suicide in 1944. Not much in Swan on the Black Sea directly about Myers, but a couple of things like the one I mentioned, And now published is Peter Lord's edition of the Diary of Winifred Tennant. And if you look at that, the script 12 in Song of the Black Sea about her relationships with her glamorous and difficult sisters-in-law is absolutely spot on in terms of what's produced in Lord. Matthew Manning claimed to have communicated with Myers, but look, the generalisation, I did a lot of work on automatic writing when I was alive, I could never work it out. You know, it's nothing there at all. Barbanel report, Maurice Barbanel, famous spiritualist. Yes, I've seen Myers, yes, rushing around, he's got lots of energies, he's trying to get scientists in this world to collaborate with your world. Possible link with the Skull report there. He's off on a scheme, doesn't listen to others, again, rather characteristic of Myers. And then, of course, the most famous one of all, possibly, the Skull report. But Myers is a shadowy figure in that. He's not the main communicator. But the puzzles that were set and information about the SPR and the cross correspondences is pretty accurate. And I've had several contacts with Robin Foy, and he said they themselves weren't interested in the SPR at all. They had a certain amount of literature on it, and they'd read Lodge's Survival of Man was a possible source, Alan Gold said, for some of the information, but they weren't really interested in it. So again, where did that information come from? And finally, and lastly, a really sad and tragic story through the good offices of Terence Palmer. I had contact with John and Martha McGuinness in America. Really, Steve and Shapiro and his wife. Steve Shapiro was murdered recently. The top Chicago lawyer had actually worked regularly at Supreme Court level. The emails I received back from them, and Terence Palmer, I'm sure would say the same, highly erudite, highly intelligent, full of energy, hugely gifted. And one of the people that he and his wife channeled was Myers. And again, the materials are quite consistent with Myers' personality, but you still have to say, if you're being boring and you want veridical evidence, how accurate and convincing is it? Myers appeared in a puffy academic gown, speaking style direct, multitasking, training guides to deal with the future. Consciousness is being lifted, telepathy on Earth is no explanation for survival, a whole range of things. One thing I'm just going to end on, though, is if these people are so convincing in terms of personality, philosophy, and so on, are we getting a direct acknowledgement from the personality about their life on Earth and the things that they did? And a huge gap here, Myers said, why did Browning castigate Daniel Douglas Home? Well, that's one of the most famous historical stories in this field in the late 19th century. Browning had a visceral hatred for Home and wrote this, the famous poem, Mr. Sludge. Why on earth would Myers say, why did Browning castigate him? So you get gaps like that, which lead you to think maybe something's wrong somewhere. And the last thing, lots and lots and lots of channeling occurs from lots and lots of famous people. People ask the question, if there are so many brilliant dead people, why aren't they communicating with us all the time? What about the famous dead? Well, when you start looking into the literature, you find that a number of people have tried to answer that question. Leichmann was, he may still be alive for all I know, an American MD who worked with gifted mediums and thought, right, okay, what about the famous people from the past? Einstein, Stuart Edward White, who was a very famous explorer of this field with his wife Betty, Arthur Ford, dubious medium, Edgar Cayce, very famous Eileen Garrett. What have they got to say now? And you very rarely find that you get, and the intellectual level can be reasonably high, but you very rarely find that you get enough specific information that you can pounce on, which would help convince you. And that's where I'll stop. Whatever the material, whether it's physical mediumship, whether it is automatic writing. For me, it is what precise information, no matter how philosophical material, can you validate, can you prove? Because otherwise, why would you want to trust it at all? Because I haven't got a great deal of intuition, direct psychic ability myself. I'm just a pretty kind of basic person, and I do not want to be deceived. So that's where I'll stop.